Psychology at Michigan State University, where she runs their autism research lab. And Brooke's going to be talking to us about telehealth. And she and I were just talking about the complexities of telehealth, which even with COVID going down, still plague our field, or bedevil our field, probably is a better word, for good or ill. And so, Brooke, it's a great pleasure to have you this morning, and I'll let you get going.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be able to speak with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So hopefully this will work.
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, Siri thought. Let's see, all right, share screen. All right. I think this is good. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Great.
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you. Yes, I'm really excited to talk to you today about the use of telehealth. And particularly, I'm going to be focusing on the use of telehealth to provide parent-mediated intervention in autism. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research we've been doing, as well as some of the experiences that we've had I think we've all had as we've had to rapidly consider using telehealth to deliver services, particularly in light of COVID. So I thought I would just start with an overview on what I'm talking about when I use the term parent-mediated intervention. So this is, people oftentimes use the term parent training, parent coaching, family training, parent-implemented intervention. I actually prefer the term parent-mediated intervention because I feel like that is the best description of the process by which we are thinking this intervention has its impact. But oftentimes people use these terms pretty synonymously. But what we're talking about here is a type of intervention that provides systematic instruction in strategies that help parents accomplish specific goals or outcomes for their child. And in the field of autism, or even more broadly in the field of child psychology, we find parent-mediated interventions are often used to focus on improving the parent-child interaction. So building closer relationships between the parent and the child, helping parents engage with their child in positive interactions, helping children acquire very specific developmental skills. In autism, many of these skills are focused on building social communication skills, but we also can see parent-mediated interventions being used to build daily or adaptive skills involved in toileting, self-care, etc. And then we also see these interventions being used to help parents manage any kind of challenging behavior that their child may be experiencing in the home or the community. And a number of technical reviews have really come to the conclusion that parent-mediated intervention should be considered an essential part of comprehensive intervention program for children with autism, particularly for younger children, but also it can play a very important role in working with transition age youth as well. I'm going to be focusing more on parent-mediated intervention that's designed for the early years. But in addition to it being considered an essential part of a comprehensive program, we can also consider parent-mediated intervention as a primary intervention strategy. This is particularly when we're working with very young children who might be at high likelihood of having autism, but don't maybe have a formal diagnosis. So the need for intensive intervention hasn't been established. It can serve as sort of the first line primary intervention. When we look at outcomes of research, or research outcomes on what does parent-mediated intervention do in the field of autism, we find good evidence to suggest that parent-mediated intervention can improve the children's social communication skills, adaptive skills, and behavior. So there's pretty robust evidence to suggest this particular approach can teach these skills to children. We also see evidence of, in many cases, better generalization and maintenance of skills than for therapist-only interventions. And that's because the child is learning to use their skills within those relationships and in those environments in which they're expected to use their skills. So if the parent has the skill to help their child use social communication during their daily routines, they're more likely to generalize those skills and maintain those skills than if they're being taught in more of a isolated setting. And then finally, we do see that this approach is time and cost effective in terms of the amount of time required or professional time required. So, for example, a professional could spend 1 to 2 hours per week working with the parent, and then the parent can carry over those strategies throughout the child's day. So it can increase the intensity of intervention without increasing the cost or professional time. And when we're thinking about how do we support families, but also how do we fund this type of intervention, this does seem to be an approach that is cost effective. But we also, and this is something I think is very important, I think we often very much focus on child outcomes when we think about interventions, but we all know autism impacts the broader family system, and that families are the strongest advocates for their children across the lifespan. And so I think it's also important to consider, how do these interventions impact family outcomes? And there's good evidence to suggest that it can improve parent self-efficacy, as well as reducing parenting stress. And both of these are very important, because these parenting self-efficacy and parenting stress really can influence how parents are able to support and advocate for their child across the lifespan. It also supports more positive family interactions, both within the parent-child system, but also in the broader family system. So I think there's pretty good evidence to suggest that parent-mediated intervention can be considered generally an evidence-based practice. And there have been a number of, as I said, technical review panels that have kind of come together to this conclusion. So I have been doing work in this area, in this space, for many years, and I clearly see the value of this, but I think it's really important to think beyond research settings or academic questions around this, and really figure out, well, what are we actually seeing in the community? How is parent-mediated intervention being implemented by those individuals that are the primary people that serve autistic children and their families? And so there's some good news to suggest that this particular intervention approach is valued by parents, providers, and administrators. So a study looking at the social validity of a variety of different EBPs has found that parents, providers, and administrators consider parent-mediated intervention to be socially valid, which is very important. Providers often talk about this as being a desired change to the service delivery system. So in a study of early intervention providers that was done a number of years ago, they talked about what are changes to the service delivery system that would help them better serve their families. And a common theme was improving their ability to deliver parent-mediated intervention would have a positive influence on their service delivery system. And then in a survey that was done with parents in Indiana a number of years ago, that asked them to report on what types of services their child had received and their personal view on how those different services impacted their child's growth, parents reported parent-mediated intervention as being sort of the #1 service of all the services their family had received that was helpful for promoting their child's growth. So you can see that parents really see the importance of this. But then we see, like, how is it actually being used? We see that parent-mediated intervention is highly underutilized in community settings. So in the same study looking at what do providers do, actually, only 25% of EI, early intervention providers, reported providing any kind of formal parent-mediated intervention. And in the US, early intervention as part of Part C really is designed to include families and provide family-centered care. So the fact that we see many early intervention providers not delivering parent-mediated intervention is quite alarming. In a recent study that we conducted within the community mental health system in Michigan, which is the primary system for supporting applied behavior analysis services for children that are Medicaid eligible, only 2.7% of kids received a sufficient number of sessions, as indicated by the Medicaid claims data, that would be consistent with a sequenced parent-mediated intervention model, or an evidence-based parent-mediated intervention model. So even though within the Michigan Autism Benefit, which covers ABA services for Medicaid eligible kids, even though it was a strong suggestion of that providers should be doing, or BCBAs should be providing parent training. Only 2% or 3% of kids were actually getting a sufficient number of sessions that would be even consistent with any kind of evidence-based parent-mediated intervention. And in another study that we looked at, we found that parents reported parent-mediated intervention as an unmet service need. And this was a more commonly reported theme for families from lower SES backgrounds, suggesting that there are definitely disparities in access to this type of service. So one approach that we've really thought about for a number of years now is how can we actually increase access to parent-mediated intervention? And a considerable challenge, or one of the significant challenges that people have, is oftentimes not being able to access it within their community, either because providers don't have sufficient training, or it's difficult for parents to access it during the work week. So people have really been interested in exploring the use of telehealth as a way of delivering PMI. And one of the things that really telehealth has the ability to do is it can actually surmount many family levels of barrier to access. So it can reduce the cost of services, which is often a barrier. It can reduce travel time. It can reduce the ability or the need to be within the same community as the intervention provider. And some telehealth models can be done in more of a asynchronous manner, such that parents may be able to access services outside of their work week, which may help parents access or be able to participate in ways that they can't with a more traditional delivery model. And it also has the potential to increase access in underserved communities, also including low resource countries. So we've really seen a significant interest in other countries where they don't have a existing or well-developed publicly funded service delivery system as a way of increasing access to families that are in rural outlying areas that maybe don't have a community provider even accessible to them. And then finally, I just wanted to emphasize, although we've been working on this in this field for a number of years now, it really had not, I would say telehealth really had not taken hold. There have been a number of studies focused on telehealth and autism here and there over the past 10 years. But in terms of community implementation, we really have not seen much community implementation until the time of COVID. And then we had a rapid shift where all of a sudden, providers that were doing in-person services were faced with the possibility of not being able to deliver services at all unless they rapidly shifted to telehealth. So we have seen a rapid shift. I'm sure you have all seen it. And this is kind of being represented in the literature now too. So we can see a number of studies that have come out in the last year or two really talking about, okay, what's going on and how are providers doing it and how is it working? So I think now we're at a state where we're talking a little bit about telehealth a little bit differently, rather than like, how do we get providers to think about it and do it, but really thinking about, well, how do we get providers to do it well? And what is that evidence base? And so there is a growing evidence base for the use of telehealth to deliver parent-mediated intervention in autism. Although now with COVID, we see people using telehealth in ways that may be beyond what the literature can speak to. So what we find across the literature here is that telehealth delivered PMI is acceptable to parents. We see improvements in parent fidelity. So parents are able to learn the intervention techniques and deliver them with fidelity to their children. We see increases in self-efficacy, parent self-efficacy, and decreases in stress, and some evidence for improvement in child social communication skills and disruptive behavior. So across the literature base, we're starting to see that telehealth delivered PMI really is developing a growing literature base. At the same time, this literature has been really limited by small samples, oftentimes lack of a control group. So they might have a kind of a demonstration project showing parents learn these skills, but we don't have a control group to compare it to know whether parents would have kind of shown those same skills without the telehealth program. non-randomized designs, limited follow-up, a significant lack of randomized controlled trials, and findings that have been positive but also mixed. So while we do see some promising research coming out suggesting this is a feasible approach, people are open to it, we're starting to see some improvements in what we would, similar improvements that we would see for in-person parent-mediated intervention. The literature base is still very, very new, and we need bigger, better designs to really understand how this is going to be most effective. So I'm going to talk really briefly about common telehealth service delivery models when implementing parent-mediated intervention. So probably the most common approach, and this is oftentimes what when people switched to telehealth during COVID, this is most commonly the approach that was used, which is a synchronous approach where a coach or therapist is providing instruction and feedback to a single family via video conferencing, so over Zoom. So they might meet with a family, with one provider and a parent-child dyad for a number of sessions, maybe once or twice a week for somewhere between 30 and 90 minutes over 12 weeks or so, to provide direct coaching to that family, instruction and coaching to that family. We also have seen synchronous approaches used to deliver group-based parent-mediated interventions, where the coach is running a group with multiple families and doing kind of group-based instruction via video conferencing. We also have seen asynchronous models, and this can be done in a couple ways. One might be where the family is submitting a video for review offline. The coach then reviews it on their own time and then provides the parent with either written or verbal feedback. But we're also seeing an increase, and this has been kind of growing in the field, of a parent self-directed type program where the parents are completing a tutorial or watching a webinar on their own and learning to implement these strategies without the support of a coach. And then we see hybrid models where the family is completing some learning activity on their own and receiving learning support or feedback from a coach in some way. So these are kind of the most common approaches that we've seen discussed in the literature, as well as being implemented in the community. So when we think about these different delivery models, it's important to kind of consider what is the best way to implement parent-mediated intervention over telehealth. And I kind of think about those different models that I just discussed, and really thinking about sort of two major distinctions are between sort of self-directed programs where the parent is completing all of the learning activities on their own, and a therapist-assisted program where the therapist is providing some degree of support and helping the parent learn the strategies and is providing active coaching and feedback. And when we think about sort of what would be the kind of some of the benefits of these two different approaches, clearly when we're talking about self-directed approaches, we see there's significant dissemination potential. Once a program is developed, it can be implemented at a very low cost because you do not need to have a professional. And so families are much better able to access this type of approach on their own schedule without needing to coordinate with a coach in some way. So it can disseminate at a low cost to many people, and that's really desirable. However, when we think about outcomes, at least from a variety of other fields, we see that therapist-assisted programs tend to have better outcomes. That's quite understandable. We wouldn't be in the business of providing therapy if we didn't think it was beneficial. And so when we look at research on telehealth models for something like treating depression, for example, we do see better outcomes when those telehealth models have therapist assistance. So we would imagine that probably this would extend to parent coaching in autism as well. But we don't have a lot of research actually directly comparing these types of approaches. So we were really interested in evaluating the acceptability, feasibility, and preliminary efficacy of a fully self-directed program versus a therapist-assisted telehealth parent-mediated intervention program to really understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of these two different approaches. with the understanding that if we can get the same effect with a self-directed approach as we could with a therapist-assisted approach, that has pretty significant implications for dissemination. So this was a study we ran a number of years ago, which was a pilot RCT of Project Impact, which is a parent-mediated intervention that my colleague Anna Dvorak, who's a speech pathologist, and I developed when we were working together years ago at a speech clinic in Portland, Oregon. And Project Impact has since been published. It's a manualized, evidence-based curriculum that was designed to be delivered in person in a one-to-one or group-based format. And it is an evidence-based parent-mediated intervention that is based on a naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention, or NDBI model. So for those of you that are familiar with this type of approach, I'm sure you've seen it has a lot of commonalities with other NDBIs such as ESDM or Jasper, or this early social interaction project. It includes both developmental strategies as well as naturalistic ABA strategies that are embedded within the child's daily routines. And so we adapted this approach so that it could be delivered online, with this new project being called Impact Online. And our adaptation process, we used focus groups with families and providers and administrators to help us develop what would be the self-directed component. And that included a self-directed tutorial that had a narrated slideshow, a manual parents could print out, self-check questions, exercises where they could watch videos of the video of individuals implementing strategies and sort of rate whether they were implementing them with fidelity or not, and get feedback, a homework or practice plan, and then opportunities for parents to reflect on how that worked at home. And it's designed to be done completely by the parent self. And then we developed the coaching components, which were designed to have the coach work with the family to review that homework plan that they developed on their own, review the lesson content, and then have an opportunity to practice with their child while receiving feedback from the coach, and to get assistance with homework planning. And so when we put this together, we actually, during our focus groups, it was suggested moving away from a 1 hour coaching model, which is what almost everybody in the community uses, to 2 shorter sessions. So 2 30-minute sessions per week, the first session in the week providing kind of more the instructional or didactic component and check-ins with the parent, so that the child did not need to be present and the parent could make sure that they understood the content from the tutorial. And then the second 30-minute session later in the week would be practice and feedback with the child. And our community families and providers that provide us with input on that felt like that was a much more feasible model for families. And then we, as I said, we conducted a pilot study, a pilot RCT of this, and participants were randomized to either the self-directed tutorial on its own or the self-directed tutorial plus remote therapist assistance. And I'm just going to show you a brief example of what this looked like.
Yeah, you know, but now that she's talking so much more, she's using communication so much more, it's like we kind of get used to her talking almost, you know? Exactly. Which is awesome. That's great.
She's saying like numbers, the word numbers. Oh, I know, she said hat on and put a hat on. Oh, and then she off and she said hat, and then she walked over to a rocking horse and she put it on the rocking horse and said hat on the rocking horse.
That's a great play and language.
Yeah, she's been pointing a lot too.
I'm telling you, she's just really starting to. That's so.
Yeah.
Awesome. Kimmy, that was so good that you waited till she gave you the word instead of just accepting her kind of screeching. That was great.
Yeah, she just said it like 4 times. More bubble, more bubble, more. 1, yes, 1. Okay. 1 bubble. Yes, one. More bubbles. More, good. More.
There was a point and a bubble.
I don't want bubble.
That is awesome. With a point, and she looked right at you.
So you can see here there's active opportunities for the parent to check in with the coach and do some problem solving, but also an opportunity for the parent to practice with their child and get live feedback from the coach. So in our initial pilot, we were really looking, first of all, at the feasibility of this approach. And our data suggested that we had high program engagement, which was great. We had high program engagement actually in both groups. And the amount of time the parents spent, or the amount of content that the parents accessed in the program was related to gains in their knowledge, or their intervention knowledge, as well as their intervention fidelity. So how well they implemented the strategies with their child. So some pretty strong evidence to suggest access to the content in the program was related to important parent learning outcomes. We also noted really flexible access to the self-directed component. So 45% of the logins that parents did were outside of the traditional working hours. So we're thinking about really how can we help families access content outside of a traditional work week. This is a really great way. We also saw high program acceptability, both for the treatment approach itself, as well as the website and the overall program. And then parents reported that the intervention was simple, easy. They reported ease of access to be a real benefit. They reported gains in their own skills as well as their child. And they also reported that the coach, having a coach was very helpful, those parents that were in the therapist-assisted group. So that really suggests that this is a very feasible approach, both the therapist-assisted and the self-directed program. And then we looked at parent and child outcomes. And what we found was similar gains in intervention knowledge, regardless of whether the children had therapist assistance or not, or the families. We did see greater gains in intervention fidelity for the therapist assisted group, suggesting that coaching and most likely practice and feedback was really important for increasing parents' use of the intervention strategies. We also saw greater gains in a measure of positive impact of the child on parenting, which is a measure from the family impact questionnaire that looks at sort of positive impact of having a child with a disability on the family. We saw greater gains for the therapist assisted group than the self-directed group. And we think that might be related to, again, having a coach who can kind of talk the parent through how their child is responding and really pointing out how the parents are impacting their child's skills. We saw similar improvements in parent self-efficacy and parenting stress, as well as child social communication or child communication skills across both groups. And then we saw a small advantage in socialization on the Vineland for the therapist-assisted group, but this was pretty small. And the biggest challenge here is while we saw improvements in both groups, we didn't have a control group of families that did not receive the active content. And so some of this could be because self-directed and therapist-assisted approaches work very well, and some of it could just be due to the fact that parents and children improve over time. So what we really needed to do is better understand, and this is similar to much of the literature thus far in the use of telehealth to deliver parent-mediated intervention in the field of autism, where we don't have really good robust designs. So we moved on to a comparative efficacy trial, and this was designed to replicate the previous findings by including a control group and follow-up measurement period. We also want to examine what type of pretreatment, whether pretreatment parenting stress was a moderator of parent outcomes. And this is because we hypothesized that parents that were highly stressed would have difficulty engaging, particularly in the self-directed approach, but having a coach may may make them better able to engage with the program. So we were looking to see whether that pre-treatment parenting stress might be an indicator of families that may need additional support. And then we also wanted to identify predictors of program engagement. So what are those things that we may be able to identify a priori about a family circumstance that might suggest that they would do well in this type of approach. So our method was, we had 64 families of autistic children who were between the ages of 18 and 93 months at study enrollment. We under-enrolled because we were not able to get our targeted numbers due to COVID, which is ironic. But we ended up with our final sample of 64 families. The children were age and IQ matched, and then they were randomly assigned to the intervention condition for 6 months. They received either the self-directed approach, that therapist-assisted approach, which had the tutorial plus therapist assistance, or an informational support group. And the informational support group received access to information about autism and various therapy approaches that was adapted from the Autism Speaks 100 Days kit, but they did not receive access to any of the content of the intervention program. And then they were assessed at intake after that 6-month period, and then at a 3-month follow-up after that. So we looked at parent learning, and what we found was a significant effective time and a significant time by group interaction. And here, that time by group interaction is what we're really looking for to understand treatment effects. So what we found was the parents that were in the therapist assisted group had significantly greater gains in their understanding. Oh, sorry, this is intervention fidelity, in their ability, our primary measure, intervention fidelity, in their ability to implement the strategies. They were significantly different from the IRS or control group at both post and follow-up. But they were also significantly better than the self-directed group at post and follow-up. And this really replicates what we saw with our original study, with the therapist-assisted group outperforming the self-directed group on this measure of the degree to which parents are able to use those strategies with their child during a snack routine and a play routine. But what we did not find was a significant difference between the self-directed group and the IRS or control group. And this was pretty disappointing. So it suggested that our original finding of improvements in both groups may be due partly to the passage of time, with parents just becoming more responsive to their child, and by default then using strategies that are consistent with this type of model. When we looked at intervention knowledge, we also found a significant difference between the therapist-assisted group at post compared to the IRS group, as well as compared to the, some of my bars are missing, compared to the IRS group, as well as the self-directed group. But again, no significant difference between the self-directed group and the IRS group. So this was a bit disappointing because we assumed that we would find significant, with the self-directed group was actually not significantly different from the therapist-assisted group or the control group. So it was kind of in the middle. So again, we saw that having access to the self-directed program may have increased some knowledge, but it was not as much as we would have liked. Then we looked at parent well-being, with our primary outcome being parent self-efficacy. And here we did not find a main effect of time or time by group interaction. We also looked at parenting stress. And similarly, we found no main effect of time or time by group interaction. Looking at effect sizes, we did see a relatively moderate effect size difference between the therapist-assisted group and the IRS control group from pre to post and pre to follow-up, but that was not statistically significant. But it was trending in the right direction, and so we think maybe if we were more appropriately powered, that might be important to follow up on. Looking at the positive impact of the child on the parent, again, this is a parent rating of the degree to which their child has a positive influence on their family. Here we did not find a significant effect of time, but we did find a significant time by group interaction. And looking at follow-up, we found that those families in the therapist-assisted group made significantly greater gains compared to the IRS group at post and follow-up. So again, this sort of replicated our finding in our first study and gives us more confidence that this type of approach does seem to influence parents' perceptions of the positive impact of the child on the family. So we looked at program engagement. So how well did the families engage in the program? And as I mentioned with our pilot study, we actually had pretty good engagement in both groups. But here with our larger study, we found that there was a much larger difference between how well families engaged when they'd been assigned to the therapist-assisted group versus the self-directed group. So looking at accessing the self-directed tutorial, there was a significant difference with those families in the therapist-assisted group accessing significantly more of the tutorial content than the self-directed group. And then when we looked at program completion, which is having completed at least 75% of all of the learning activities and contact sessions, we found that only about 50% of the families in the self-directed group met criteria for program completion compared to 95% of the families in the therapist-assisted group. So this tells us a lot that, that maybe our initial analyses were limited, not necessarily because parents can't learn from a self-directed approach, but perhaps it's because parents weren't able to learn because they weren't actually accessing the content. So we reran our analyses on the parent learning outcomes for just the participants who completed the intervention. So our N was much smaller. And here what we found is a significant treatment effect for the self-directed group for intervention knowledge and parent fidelity. So this actually replicates what we found in our pilot study. And now the self-directed group was no longer significantly different from the therapist-assisted group. So what this tells us is the therapist-assisted group really does tend to outperform at a group level, but much of this might be dependent on the degree to which parents are actually engaging in the program, and that parents can learn from a self-directed program, but they may have difficulty actually engaging with that program if they're not getting outside support, or some portion of families are not getting, are having difficulty engaging with that. We also looked at pre-treatment parenting stress to determine, did this moderate parenting outcomes? So this was, again, our hypothesis was those families that were in the self-directed group would have much more difficulty if they were highly stressed than parents who were highly stressed who were assigned to the therapist-assisted group. So we included a pre-treatment parenting stress as a moderator, but we did not find that moderated parenting outcomes. So then we also looked at program acceptability, and we found that parents in both groups found the intervention that they were learning to be equally acceptable. So the treatment acceptability was high and positive. They were both satisfied with the program, but there was a significantly greater program satisfaction for the therapist-assisted group, and parents who were in the therapist-assisted group reported fewer barriers to treatment than the self-directed group. And this is kind of, again, giving us more information about how that therapist assistance is really helping parents navigate barriers and is leading to overall better engagement and higher program satisfaction. So we also looked at predictors of program engagement, and here we looked at a variety of parent demographic variables. The only parent demographic variable that was related to program engagement was parent age, so we included that in the model. Then we looked at several other a priori predictors. One was whether or not the families got that therapist assistance, their treatment expectancy, or the extent to which they felt like the therapy was going to be helpful for them and their child, the acceptability of the intervention they were learning, so the acceptability of the project impact techniques, and then the overall program satisfaction. And we did a regression model, and we found that parent age, presence of therapist assistance, and then overall program satisfaction were significant independent predictors of program engagement. So those are really helpful, again, demonstrating that therapist assistance is really important for helping families navigate this process. So in summary, I think we have some evidence from our studies on impact online that telehealth-based parent-mediated intervention is highly feasible. And there is some benefit of self-directed learning. However, that benefit is really limited to whether or not the families are able to engage in the actual self-directed program on their own. And we can see at least 50% of families were not able to do that. So when we think about this at a broader sort of implementation level, we do have to question whether self-directed programs or completely self-directed programs are going to have the intended outcomes for many families. We also find that coaching is very important, particularly for improving fidelity. The impact on parenting self-efficacy and parenting stress, however, is much less clear in this particular study. And I think some of that may be due to our low power, but I do think that it causes us, and the fact that we were actually implementing part of this towards the end during COVID, which led to increases in parenting stress. But I do think that we have less robust evidence to suggest that this program is having positive benefits on these parent outcomes. And so I'm not going to be able to talk about the child data yet because we have not completed all of those analyses, but our next step is obviously to examine the impact on child outcomes. So I just want to, I want to make sure I have time for questions, but I want to kind of pivot a little bit to thinking about moving from kind of an efficacy study to really better understanding how does this work in the real world. And thinking about the fact that we do have at least some evidence to suggest that self-directed learning can benefit parents who engage in the program, we really have to understand, is this kind of thing going to work in the real world? Because even with our study, these were all families that were enrolled in a treatment trial through a lab. And we really have very limited understanding in the field of the reach of telehealth intervention. So if a family is offered an intervention, are they going to uptake it? We don't know. We really only see families that have chosen to enroll in trials. We also don't know how well the families that enroll in these trials are representative of participants that would actually use it in the real world. And there are significant concerns about parent engagement and attrition for community users for e-health interventions in general. And we saw low engagement in our self-directed group, even in our trial studies. So understanding to what extent this would actually work in the real world is pretty important. So we don't really have a good understanding of the effectiveness in community settings at all. So we did a study where we looked at, we pulled data from those families that were participating in our pilot study, as well as our comparative efficacy study. And those were the families that were in what we called our controlled trial. So these are families that had enrolled in the study as part of an efficacy trial. And then we did an open trial. And these were families that did not really have to enroll through a lab. They were able to just consent online. And these groups differed a bit in terms of the recruitment program and follow-up. So in terms of recruitment, our open trial families heard about this the program by getting a flyer at a diagnostic feedback session, through links on a statewide ASD website or through web search. Whereas our recruitment strategy for our control group were flyers distributed to local providers. All of the families in the open trial consented and had self-administered assessments within the program, and they received the self-directed program, and they had no contact with research staff. And then we just looked at those folks that were in the self-directed group, but in our control trial, they consented and did the assessment in the lab, had a lot of contact with lab staff. They were then randomly assigned to that self-directed, therapist-assisted, or IRS control group, and they had ongoing contact throughout the study. And then for follow-up, the open trial, they were emailed a follow-up survey after 6 months after registration, whereas the folks in the controlled trial did post-assessments with us through the lab after 6 months. So we just compared those families that were in the self-directed approach, that were in the self-directed program in the trial, to those that received the self-directed program through the community. And we were able to also look at on-site referrals made to impact at that community for the open trial. So we could see, like, of those families that were given information about the study, how many of them actually registered. So like one of our referral sites gave out information about the program to 139 families, and then we were able to track of those 139 families how many actually registered, and about 74% did not register. So we have pretty low reach. We have a reach of about 25%. So about 26% of families that were given information about the program chose to register. And then we compared those register users to the referral sample, and there were no significant differences in terms of child age, child's gender, or median income for families. So it does suggest that those who register look pretty similar to those that don't, but we have a relatively low registration rate. Then we looked at the participant demographics, comparing those families that were in the controlled trial versus the open trial, and they were not significantly different, with the one exception of mean chronological age in months. They were older in the open trial, and that's because we didn't have the upper limit. And then finally, we looked at the rate of attrition. And here we were just comparing those families that were in the controlled trial who received the self-directed program only to those families that were in the open trial who had access to the self-directed program. And what you can see here is that we still had relatively good retention across the 12 lessons of the program for families in the self-directed group. On average, they stayed in they completed many of the lessons, although we did have decreasing over time. But we had this rapid drop off in those folks in the open trial with, by lesson 3, fewer than 40% of people were completing it. And then we had kind of the slower rate. So this suggests that we're going to have real significant challenges keeping families engaged in a program that's long, 12 modules out. It takes an hour to complete each module in just a general community users without any kind of additional support. And we did again find program engagement was associated with change in intervention knowledge. So again, this is more evidence to suggest that we really need to have families engaging with the program to be able to learn the content. And then finally, we just looked at benefits, limitations, and recommendations from those community users. And they suggested that program benefits were, they thought it was very accessible, it was easy to learn the intervention, they thought that intervention strategies were acceptable, and they noted improvement in their child's social communication skills. So they noted many of the same benefits that parents that were in one of the controlled trials noted. Program limitations, a reported limitation was need for therapist support, lack of online community support, how long it took, stress in the home, and technology barriers that made completing it difficult. And then recommendations families gave us were getting telehealth conference support from a coach and increasing online community support, simplification of the training components, making it shorter and easier, and making it more available on other platforms so people could complete it on their phone, on an iPad, rather than having to do it on a computer. So in conclusion, we find that thinking about, again, that dissemination aspect, we do have the potential for significant dissemination when we're thinking about self-directed programs, but they do have limit, or at least ours had relatively limited reach. Although the families that did choose to do it were pretty similar to the referral sample. Engagement was significantly lower, although there was a similar effect on parent learning with parents who do more of the program, learning more of the intervention content. But this really tells us that we really need methods to enhance engagement in real world settings. So I'm going to leave it there so that we have some time for questions. But before I do that, I just wanted to thank really quick, thank my research team. I've had amazing graduate students that have worked on this project over their years in my lab, as well as our funders, which included HRSA and the DoD. Thank you.
So if anybody would like to ask a question, feel free to put it in the chat. Brooke, I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, we got one. Oh, it's from
What are
Fred.
What are the limitations for community practitioners? So I think that there are a number, I actually kind of skipped over some of this just because of timing, but I think one of the things that we saw when we were doing a lot of work with community providers to help them do parent coaching in general, and they were doing in-person parent coaching, and we were working with them while we had this rapid transition to COVID. And so we got to see what community providers were experiencing during this rapid transition. And I think one of the significant challenges for community providers is that they have limited training in parent coaching in general, and then limited training in telehealth on top of that. And so I think that was one thing that was relatively challenging for folks to have to do that fast pivot. But on the other hand, one of the things that was really interesting that we observed clinically, and then we also found in some of our research when we were doing surveys with community practitioners, is that telehealth actually pulls for parent coaching in a way that in-person therapy does not. So when you're doing in-person therapy, it's very easy for the clinician to kind of work with the child. And most clinicians really enjoy working with kids. That's how they go into this field. And so getting clinicians who are uncomfortable coaching parents to coach parents can be a little bit more challenging, because they can kind of revert to what's comfortable and just work with the child. Or similarly, if the parent is uncomfortable participating, it's a lot easier for the parent to sort of sit back and let the therapist work with the child. But one of the real benefits of telehealth-based parent coaching is the therapist isn't there. So the parent really does have to work with the child, and it actually facilitates more opportunity for parent practice and provider feedback. So one of the things we heard a lot from our providers was, wow, telehealth made me a better coach, because I really had to stop and think about, how am I going to help this parent do this, because I can't be there to help. And so I do actually think that therapists can actually effectively deliver parent coaching very well over telehealth. I think telehealth is much more limited for other types of therapy. And we actually saw this in some of our data. We surveyed BCBAs who provide ABA services, and found that they were reporting much more success with parent coaching than direct intervention, as well as direct assessment. So I think when we think about telehealth, we have to think about, what are we actually doing? And it's not like telehealth is good for everything. Telehealth works well for certain things. I think it works very well for parent coaching. It has this added benefit of, you can actually see the family's living environment, which you may not if the family's coming into the clinic for coaching. But it may not work very well it may not work as well when you're trying to do direct child therapy, for example, for kids at a certain age, or for if you're trying to do direct assessment of a variety of skills where you need to have a little bit more control of the presses that you do. So I think it's, I don't think it's telehealth is good or bad. I think it's, we need to really think about what it lends itself well to. And I think parent coaching is one of those things.
Great. Thanks so much, Brooke. This was fantastic. When we're thinking about, rural health and delivery models, this is really fantastic. I mean, that's something people are struggling with. And, we have one of the issues with adults, of course, is that often, again, they're at long distances from where we are. And so the idea of being able to deliver services. So this is great. Thank you so much for coming. This is a fantastic presentation. Everybody gets set for April Autism Month. And Brooke, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
There's
everyone.
our flyer. There's our flyer.
Yes. I just put up our flyer for our April conference, which is held virtually, and registration is open right now.